They told you that Moses stood before Pharaoh, that seas split open, that plagues fell from the sky, and that a nation of slaves walked out of Egypt in triumph, led by the hand of God himself. Yet, what if I told you that none of it happened? That the most famous rescue story in the Bible is nothing more than a carefully crafted lie repeated so many times that it became unquestioned truth, and that by the end of this investigation, you will see how archaeology, history, and even the Bible itself collapse under the weight of this myth. So let us begin where the legend itself begins, with Egypt. Because if 2 million people walked out of Pharaoh's empire in one night, there should be mountains of evidence. Traces in ruins, records in temples, references in papyrus scrolls. Yet Egypt remains silent. Not a single word about Hebrews fleeing, not a single scar in the sands to prove this monumental event. And remember, Egypt was obsessed with record keeping. They carved victories and defeats on temple walls. They recorded taxes, grain storage, even the names of slaves. Yet somehow they forgot to mention the greatest slave rebellion in history. Ask yourself why. Because silence is not evidence of conspiracy. Silence is evidence of absence. And the absence here is deafening. And then consider the logistics. 2 million people wandering through the desert for 40 years, leaving no bones, no weapons, no pottery, no campsites. Archaeologists have scoured Sinai, and what they found is nothing. The desert is littered with remains of tiny nomadic tribes, yet not a trace of a massive exodus. And that is impossible to explain if it truly happened. And here is the bitter truth. The Exodus is not history. It is theater. It is political propaganda, a story invented centuries later to give a shattered people a shared identity, a tale that told them they were chosen, they were rescued, they had divine destiny. And the shocking part is that even within the Bible, the story contradicts itself. One passage says 600,000 men walked out. Another suggests a tiny clan left. One verse says they wandered 40 years. Another implies just a generation. These contradictions are not innocent mistakes. They are fingerprints of fabrication, the marks left behind by storytellers weaving and rewriting over centuries. And you must stop and ask, why would they need to invent such a story? The answer is as devastating as it is simple, because a nation without a past is fragile, but a nation with a divine origin is unbreakable. The Exodus was not about truth, it was about power. You can see this when you realize the story was not even written anywhere near the time it supposedly happened. Scholars trace the Exodus account to the late Kingdom of Judah, hundreds of years after Moses supposedly lived, when priests and scribes were desperate to unify tribes under one God and one law. What better way than to invent a past where their God crushed the mightiest empire on earth? And here's a thought that should shake you. If the Exodus collapses, what else collapses with it? Christianity builds on this foundation. Jesus' Last Supper is tied to Passover. The symbolism of liberation is central. So if Exodus is myth, then much of the theological foundation is myth as well. Because without Exodus, there is no chosen people. Without chosen people, there is no covenant. Without covenant, there is no Messiah. And suddenly, the entire house of cards trembles. Imagine for a moment that you were an Egyptian scribe living during the supposed time of Moses. Your job is to record everything, every grain stored, every flood of the Nile, every minor skirmish. Yet somehow you do not write a single word about a mass of Hebrew slaves escaping. You do not write about 10 plagues devastating the land. You do not write about Pharaoh's army swallowed by the sea. This silence is not just suspicious, it's damning, because if such calamities had struck Egypt, they would have left scars in both record and landscape, but there are none. And when archaeologists dig into the time period the Bible places the Exodus in, they find Egypt flourishing, stable, not reeling from catastrophic collapse. The cities supposedly abandoned by fleeing slaves show no sudden depopulation. Instead, they show continuity of Egyptian life, grain stores filled, temples functioning, bureaucracy intact. And the Bible tells us that the Hebrews built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, yet excavations reveal these cities were constructed centuries after the supposed Exodus. Anachronism is one of the clearest fingerprints of myth, someone writing long after the event, inserting details that betray their distance from real events. When scholars dissect the origin of the Exodus narrative, they find it was written hundreds of years later during the Kingdom of Judah, a small, struggling state surrounded by empires, desperate to forge a sense of divine destiny. So priests and scribes crafted a story that turned their fragile existence into a cosmic drama. In their version, they weren't a minor hill tribe, but the chosen people rescued by the hands of God from the greatest empire on earth. And once a people believe they are chosen, they will endure anything, fight anyone, and justify any act as holy. Every ancient people had their origin myths, but Israel's scribes elevated theirs to history, embedding it in law and ritual until it became unquestioned. The Exodus was not just a story, it was institutionalized in Passover, retold every year, drilled into the minds of children until generations later no one doubted it. And then Christianity took this myth and supercharged it, framing Jesus as the new Moses, aligning his crucifixion and resurrection with Passover to give the illusion that he fulfilled the Exodus cycle. So if Exodus is myth, then the Christian claim that Jesus completes that myth also collapses. One invention becomes the root of centuries of doctrine. And then there is the weaponization of Exodus, not only as a story of identity, but as a tool of domination. Because once you create a myth of chosenness, you create a myth of exclusion. Once you claim God liberated you from Egypt, you claim he condemned your enemies. This narrative gave priests and kings the authority to declare wars, seize lands, and subjugate others, all in the name of divine will. The conquest stories in Joshua flow directly from Exodus, portraying Canaan not as an inhabited land, but a promised land ordained by God to be seized. Yet archaeology demolishes this too, because Jericho, the city supposedly brought down by trumpets after the Exodus, was not even standing in the time frame the Bible places it. Its walls had already been destroyed centuries earlier. If Exodus collapses, then much of what Christians believe about their Savior's mission collapses with it. The symbolism of Passover becomes hollow. The Last Supper loses its prophetic weight. The very idea of divine rescue fades. And this is why defenders fight so hard to protect the myth, because if the Exodus falls, the house of faith trembles. But you must ask yourself, why does truth need defending? If it is truth, should it not stand on its own? Every defense of Exodus is riddled with excuses, shrinking numbers, moving dates, inventing miracles that erase evidence. But that is not how truth behaves. That is how lies survive. If Exodus never happened, then the God who claimed to orchestrate it never acted, which means for centuries people worshipped a silence, prayed to an invention, submitted their lives to a narrative crafted by scribes with political motives. And that realization is devastating. But it's also liberating, because once you see the lie for what it is, you are no longer bound by it. You begin to see how much of faith has been shaped not by divine revelation, but by human invention. Now we arrive at the crushing conclusion, the final blow to the story that billions still cling to. When you gather all the evidence together, the verdict is undeniable. The Exodus never happened. Not as history, not as fact. It exists only as myth, born from the imagination of scribes centuries after the supposed events, crafted not to record memory, but to invent identity. Without Exodus, there is no covenant at Sinai, no tablets given by God's own hand. Without Exodus, the prophets lose their foundation. The rituals of Passover are exposed as reenactments of fiction, and the theology of Christianity loses its prophetic anchor, because Jesus being the new Moses only makes sense if Moses was real, but he wasn't. And that means one of the pillars propping up Christianity is hollow. The silence of Egypt speaks louder than any sermon. The emptiness of Sinai shouts louder than any hymn. The contradictions of Scripture scream louder than any priest. And when you listen closely, you realize the entire story collapses under its own weight. For centuries, people have bowed their heads at Passover tables. Churches have raised their voices in hymns. Nations have justified wars, all rooted in a story that never happened. And now we must look at one of the most sacred assumptions still left standing, that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Torah, the law of Moses. But what if I told you that even this belief collapses under the slightest historical and textual pressure? Because scholars have examined the text carefully, and what they found is undeniable. These books were not written by a single person. They are stitched together from different sources, each with its own style, vocabulary, and theology. One source calls God Elohim, another calls him Yahweh. One portrays God as distant and majestic, Another shows him walking and talking with humans face to face. And get this, sometimes the same story is told twice with glaring contradictions. In Genesis, we have 2 separate creation stories, 2 flood accounts, 2 introductions of different laws. Why would one author do this? They would not, because there was no single author. What we have is a composite, a patchwork, a complex editorial effort to merge competing traditions into a single national narrative. The documentary hypothesis, now widely accepted among scholars, breaks it down into 4 main sources: J, E, D, and P, the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly source. Each came from a different time, a different region, a different purpose. And guess what? They were all written centuries after Moses was supposed to have lived. Let that sink in. The Law of Moses was written by people who never met Moses, never saw him, never had access to first-hand accounts, because there were none. The earliest Hebrew scriptures emerged during or after the Babylonian exile. That is more than 500 years after the events supposedly took place, and the final redactions came even later. So why do we still call it the Law of Moses? Because attributing these writings to a mythical prophet gave them authority, it gave them weight, it gave them holiness. That is how religious power works. It does not need facts, it needs symbols. And Moses is the ultimate symbol. He is the liberator, the lawgiver, the chosen messenger. But in reality, he is a literary creation, an avatar of a nation's hopes and fears, woven together by anonymous hand. And the deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes. Moses never speaks of the Babylonian exile, or of events during the divided monarchy, or the rise of empires that shaped the Jewish world. He is frozen in a mythic past that looks suspiciously like the concerns of later writers projected backward. That is not prophecy. That is editing. That is retroactive storytelling. That is a nation rewriting its trauma into triumph, its chaos into order, its defeat into divine destiny. And this matters because if we can understand how Moses was invented, then we can start to understand how religious truth is created, not found. It is shaped, crafted, rewritten, reinforced, and ultimately weaponized. The myth of Moses is not harmless. It has been used to justify conquest, colonization, and the erasure of other traditions. It has been invoked to silence women, persecute non-believers, enforce outdated laws, and build walls between people. And yet, when we pull back the curtain, we see the machinery. The multiple authors, the borrowed myths, the political agendas, the endless redactions. We see that the authority we were told to obey was built on sand. And that is both terrifying and liberating, because it means we are no longer bound, we are no longer trapped, we are no longer forced to accept teachings from a man who never lived. We can instead return to the core of what makes us human: empathy, compassion, curiosity, doubt, not blind obedience to stone tablets, but open-hearted dialogue with one another.